No single event of the Indian Wars has been subject to more exaggeration and overemphasis than the November 29, 1864 attack by the Colorado Volunteers under the command of Colonel John M. Chivington on a village of Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek, Colorado Territory. In A Century of Dishonor, Helen Hunt Jackson made it Exhibit A in her catalog of wrongs inflicted on the Indians. Most later writers have followed her lead, although the colonel does have a few defenders. Colonel J. M. Chivington was in civil life a Methodist minister. He went west from Ohio, where he got religion and entered into the ministry. In 1850, he was in Colorado, but later moved to Missouri, where the abolitionist controversy gave his extraordinarily belligerent nature a better chance to find the strife it enjoyed. He took part in the anti-slavery movement, first as a preacher and later as a member of Jim Lane's Free State Bushwhackers. After the Border War, he again assumed the cloth, and at the outbreak of the Civil War was presiding elder of his church in Denver. Chivington preached often to the soldiers in the barracks. His fire-eating eloquence pleased them. When the 1st Colorado Cavalry was raised in 1862, he declined an appointment as a chaplain, saying, "If I go with the soldiers, I am going to fight." The governor gave him a major's commission instead. He soon received his colonelcy. At the Battle of Glorieta Pass, he led a surprise attack on the rear guard and supply train that was decisive in repelling the Confederate invasion of New Mexico. He was promoted to colonel and district commander, provoking the jealousies of many volunteer officers. Backed by a party demanding immediate statehood for Colorado, he was a candidate for Congress in a bitter political campaign that had bearings on the congressional inquiries into his conduct at Sand Creek. The Southern Cheyenne had been in eastern Colorado for a little over 60 years, since 1800, when they came from the north. They became allies of the Arapaho, and by constant warfare with the Ute to the westward and the Pawnee to the eastward, maintained hunting grounds sufficient for their needs. Late in 1858, prospectors discovered gold in the Rocky Mountains. A flood of prospectors and miners trailed across Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. In order to quell the rising tensions between settlers and Indians, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs traveled to Bent's Fort out west to sign a new treaty with the Indians. The Treaty of Fort Weiss in 1861 redefined Cheyenne and Arapaho hunting grounds from the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. 10 chiefs signed the Treaty of Fort Weiss, 6 from the Cheyenne and 4 from the Arapaho. They ceded 53 million acres of their land over to the United States. The 6 Cheyenne chiefs who signed the treaty were Black Kettle, White Antelope, Lean Bear, Little Wolf, Tall Bear, and Left Hand. The Arapaho chiefs were Little Raven, Storm, Shavehead, and Big Mouth. The new reserve was located in eastern Colorado along the Arkansas River. The Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes were nevertheless split with widespread animosity between the different clans and war parties regarding the justice of the treaty. Many of these Indian bands outright refused to abide by the new treaty and continued to roam the hunting grounds and territory of western Kansas to central Wyoming. These roving bands included the warlike fraternity of the famed and feared Dog Soldiers. These bands would continue their nomadic way of life, following the hunt and waging total war against their Indian and white enemies. Although their Indian way of life was disturbed in 1859 by the Pikes Peak or Bust gold rush, there was no serious clash until 1863. In what was called the 9 Mile Massacre, in January of 1863, Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors attacked a wagon train on the Santa Fe Trail west of Fort Larned, Kansas. All the teamsters were killed and the train is ransacked and burned. 2 months later, when a Cheyenne war party moving against the Ute levied forced contributions on settlers along the way. This was followed by reports of horses, mules, and cattle stolen, possibly by hungry Indians. Lieutenant Clark Dunn was sent to retrieve the stolen 60 head of oxen and 12 mules and horses. 4 American soldiers were killed for his trouble, and the Indians retained their stolen livestock. On March 27th of 1863, by invitation of President Lincoln, Cheyenne chiefs War Bonnet, White Antelope, Standing in Water, and Dog Soldier Lean Bear traveled to Washington, D.C. with chiefs from Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Caddo tribes. The chiefs hold a peace council with Lincoln and visit several eastern cities to learn about industry and farming. Lincoln promises the chiefs that the whites will do all they can to help the Indians learn to farm and build settlements, provided the Indians quit their wild and nomadic ways and conform to the government law. The chiefs return with new hopes of peace, but the stubborn resistance of the Dog Soldiers and the majority of other warrior clans is growing. Despite the peace talks, tensions between the settlers and Indian tribes only continued to increase in the Colorado Territory. The Utes, enemies of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, descended out of their mountain homes and commenced raiding white settlements close to the mountains in the west. Reservation Cheyenne and Arapahoes attempt to raid Fort Larned's whiskey stash, an incident where a Fort Guard and Osage Indian agent shoot and kill a Cheyenne warrior. Sioux raiding parties descend in the Colorado Territory from the north. Apache and Comanche warbands penetrate the territory from the southwest and the southeast respectively, with little hope of aid arriving from the east. Due to the war between the states, the exasperated Governor Evans sends out a messenger to the Sioux and Cheyenne to meet for a peace council at a designated area along the Arkansas River. The effort to bring the Cheyenne to peace council with Governor Evans appears to be successful. On September 6th of 1863, Evans is escorted to the Republican River in Kansas to meet with Black Kettle and other chiefs who have wandered off the reservations. But the Cheyenne leaders don't show up at the designated meeting spot. The messenger Elbridge Gerry travels to the Smoke Hill Fork, where the main body of Cheyenne are camped, and discovers that the Dog Soldiers are now camped there as well. It is surmised that the Dogmen prevent Black Kettle and White Antelope and one of their other leaders, Bull Bear, from attending the council with Evans, indicating a dramatic shift in the political power structure of the Cheyenne Nation. Due to the overall dissatisfaction with Black Kettle and White Antelope's participation in the Treaty of Fort Wise, the militarily superior Dog Soldiers have apparently seized enough power and influence to overrule the peaceable inclined chiefs. This includes the Dog Soldier peace advocates, Lean Bear and Bull Bear. Evans returns to Denver, angry that the Cheyenne refused to meet with him. He approaches the Arapaho chief Roman Nose with a similar proposal to hold a peace council, and this similarly is rebuked. Roman Nose sends word to Evans that the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Kiowa are disposed to go to war with the whites. Speaking for the Arapahoes, who are highly dependent upon the protection of the Cheyenne, Roman Nose tells Evans that his tribe has no interest in holding any talks under these circumstances. The Cheyenne and Arapaho continue to roam the plains, with some tribes returning to the fort when the buffalo depart and the food becomes scarce. The raids continue into the year 1864, and rumors begin to circulate that the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and Kiowa are entering into an alliance to wipe the white settlers out of the Colorado Territory for good. On June 11th of 1864, an Indian raiding party, believed to be Arapahoes, attacked and brutally murdered a young family on the Isaac Van Warmer Ranch near Box Elder Creek, vicinity of present-day Elizabeth, Colorado. A small posse of ranchers, freighters, and soldiers, searching for Indian cattle thieves, soon discovered the hideously mutilated bodies of Van Vormer's ranch hand, Nathan Hungate, his wife Ellen, and 2 daughters, Laura, age 2, and Florence, who was 5 months old. Hungate's body was mutilated and scalped. Ellen had been raped before she was stabbed repeatedly and scalped. The children were nearly decapitated. Van Warmer, who was away from the ranch at the time, undoubtedly escaped a similar fate. The horrified and angry freighters brought the ravaged Hungate bodies to Denver and displayed them in the center of town, sending a shock across the Colorado Territory. This specific incident justified Governor Evans' fears that the Indian tribes had united and had initiated a full-scale war against the citizens of the Plains territories. The month of July is a desperate one for the settlers. Dog soldiers and Sioux warrior clans have consolidated and are running raids along the Republican and Platte River routes. 8 vicious attacks have left half a dozen white settlers dead, with several hundred head of horses and cattle stolen. The Platte route, Denver's primary source of supplies, is cut off as the warriors continue to inexorably move toward the unprotected Denver. Evans continues to plead to Washington for help, but the Civil War in the East preoccupies General Curtis and the War Department. 2 more Indian attacks closer to Denver on Bayou Creek, 5 settlers murdered and scalped. Dog soldiers and Sioux warriors attack and burn 4 wagon trains at Cow Creek, Kansas. The famed Kiowa war chief, Satanta, has arrived from the south, and after deceiving the sentries at Fort Larned with whiskey and squaws, empties the fort's corrals, killing a sentry and stealing over 250 heads of horses and mules. Taking advantage of the carnage, white renegades, such as the 9-membered Reynolds Gang, began robbing banks and stagecoaches in the Arkansas River Territory. Dog soldiers and Sioux warriors continue their depredations into the month of August, attacking ranches, stage stations, and any isolated settlements that they can attack with impunity. One of the more heartbreaking of incidents is the kidnapping and enslaving of Laura Roper, age 16, Lucinda Eubank, 23, and that of Lucinda's children, Isabel, age 3, William Jr., 6 months, and nephew Ambrose Archer, age 7. Laura Roper and the 3-year-old Isabel are given to the Cheyenne. Lucinda Eubank and her 6-month-old child are given to the Sioux. The town of Denver was in a constant state of panic during the summer and early fall of 1864. One false alarm sent all women and children to brick business houses that were fortified and guarded. Planes travel slowed to a trickle. The supply of coal oil, kerosene, was exhausted, and settlers had to use candles. The Rocky Mountain News newspaper was printed on pink tissue paper. With the Indians killing and driving off the cattle herds, food became scarce. Locusts descended upon the farms, putting a further strain on the food supply. Colonel Chivington declared martial law in Denver. A regiment of 100-day volunteers to fight the Indians was raised as the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. Its colonel, John L. Shope, in later years became Idaho's last territorial governor and first elected governor. On August 29th, before his regiment saw active service, a letter from Black Kettle of the Cheyenne at Fort Leon on the Arkansas River, 150 miles southeast of Denver, which said that hostiles had offered to exchange prisoners in their hands for those held in Denver. Reports from Agent Coley at Fort Leon indicate that the Southern Cheyenne and Arapahoes are comprised mostly of peaceably inclined Indians. The letter, however, could hardly be considered a ceasefire because it admitted frankly, quote, "There are 3 Cheyenne war parties out yet and 2 of the Arapahoes," end quote. Indeed, many of the young sons of the chiefs, including Little Raven's son by the same name, has in fact rebuked his father's efforts to make peace and is leading an Arapaho war party in the Arkansas River region. Major E.W. Wynkoop of the 1st Cavalry at Fort Leon, eager to recover the captives, marched a small force to the Indian camp. There, convinced of Black Kettle's sincerity, he persuaded a delegation of chiefs to go to Denver. Evans, governor of the Colorado Territory, meanwhile issued a proclamation stating, quote, "Friendly Arapahoes and Cheyennes belonging to the Arkansas River will go to Major Coley, U.S. Indian Agent at Fort Leon, who will give them provisions and show them a place of safety. The war on hostile Indians will be continued until they are effectively subdued." End quote. During the summer of 1864 alone, There were 32 Indian attacks on record. These resulted in the deaths of 96 settlers, 21 being wounded, and 11 women and children being captured. Between 700 and 800 livestock were stolen, 12 wagon trains and stagecoaches were attacked, robbed, or destroyed, and 9 settlements and ranches were raided. From Fort Leavenworth, Major General Samuel Ryan Curtis, commander of the Department of Kansas, telegraphed Chivington prior to the conference with the chiefs. "I shall require the bad Indians delivered up, restoration of equal numbers of stock, and also hostages to secure. I want no peace till the Indians suffer more." These are the orders under which Colonel Chivington acted when he told the chiefs at Denver, "My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms and submit to military authority. You are nearer Major Wynkoop than anyone else, and you can go to him when you are ready to do that." Black Kettle returned to his village on Sand Creek. He did not even move his band to Fort Leon, as both Governor Evans and Colonel Chivington had demanded. No arms were surrendered, no hostages given, no bad Indians delivered, no stock restored. Major Wynkoop, however, had recovered 4 prisoners and reported that he was continuing to negotiate with the Indians. General Curtis considered this a violation of his orders and relieved Wynkoop from command, demanding an investigation of charges that the major had issued supplies to hostile Indians, meaning Black Kettle's band. At this time, Chivington, having waited 2 months after his conference with Black Kettle, decided to act before expiration of the 100-day enlistment of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. Detachments from 6 companies of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, with 2 howitzers, joined the expedition, which marched in the bitter cold through snow, sometimes 2 feet deep. Chivington halted all traffic as he marched along the roads to prevent any warning from reaching Black Kettle's band through traders. In the afternoon on November 28th, Chivington's militia arrives at Fort Leon and requests the assistance of Major Anthony in his attack upon Black Kettle's village on the Sand Creek. Major Anthony concurs and orders his troops to prepare for the march. 2 officers, Captain Soule and Lieutenant Kramer, lead the group of Fort Leon officers in protest of Chivington's intended attack. Despite their protests, by 8 p.m., Chivington's 500-man 3rd Colorado Regiment militia, with 250 soldiers from the combined forces of the 1st Regiment from Denver and Fort Leon, marches for Sand Creek. The attack at dawn of November 29, 1864, on the Sand Creek camp came as a complete surprise for Black Kettle. Captain Soule and Lieutenant Kramer do not participate in the initial charge and lead their companies aside. Despite their unpreparedness, Cheyenne and Arapaho quickly rallied from cover along the banks of the creek and put up a stiff fight that lasted all day until dark, giving the lie to any idea that this was a slaughter of unresistant Indians or that the camp was mainly women and children. After the first deadly volley, the Cheyennes ran up the bed of the creek. A detachment of soldiers cut off the pony herd. Some of the warriors stayed in the village to cover the retreat. Among these were Black Kettle and the fine old chief White Antelope, then 75 years old. Black Kettle saw that it was useless to remain and urged White Antelope to run with him. But the old chief stood in his tracks, singing his death song with arms folded. Meantime, the warriors who had fought in the village were all killed. Chivington was in possession of the camp. Up the creek about 3/4 of a mile, the Cheyennes scooped holes in the sand with rifles and made a stand. Braves, squaws, and children were mixed up together. The troops were disorganized. Some lined up and shot at the Indians, the rest scattered wildly. Some looting the lodges and others killed the stragglers. Still others scalped and mutilated the dead. The Cheyennes battled desperately in the creek bed. The firing was at long range, and try as they might, the soldiers could not dislodge them. But by noon, 2 howitzers were brought up and began shelling into the position. That broke the stubborn line. The Indians fell back to a new position, leaving their dead where they lay. Chivington followed, again with the dreaded wagon guns, as the Indians called them, thundering. The Cheyennes retreated. This program of stand, bombard, and retreat continued all day. The soldiers drove the Indians back 5 miles. Women and children were killed, although Private William M. Breckinridge, in later years a deputy sheriff under John H. Behan, Wyatt Earp's rival at Tombstone, said, "I saw very few squaws and no children, and further, there are a lot of scalps of white men and of women, some very fresh, found on the teepees. But so far as scalps went, our boys had the best of it, for every dead Indian was scalped once, and some of them 2 or 3 times." Assistant Surgeon Caleb S. Birdsall reported that a soldier brought 5 or 6 white scalps to him, and further stated, "My impression is that 1 or 2 of them was not more than 10 days off the head." What clearer indication could there be that the war parties had been out since the peace talks 2 months before? The final exaggeration of the Sand Creek fight has been its representation as a direct cause of the great uprising of Plains Indians when the Cheyennes spread word of the white man's perfidy. It would be difficult to prove that any other tribes were influenced by such a plea, or that Indian warfare became any more intense than it had been previously. One of the causes of the Sand Creek incident was Governor Evans's fear of, quote, "an alliance of Indians on the plains," unquote. But there was no such concert of action among Plains tribes before Sand Creek or afterwards, or at any other time. The actual result of Sand Creek was that its survivors fled northward, carrying along with them Sioux and Arapaho bands that had been raiding along the Kansas and Smoky Hill rivers. What the Colorado Volunteers had accomplished was to drive Indians out of their territory only to dump them across the Oregon Trail. In the following months, partisan politics will dictate the story of the massacre at Sand Creek. The political rival to both Governor Evans and Colonel John Chivington, Major Edward Wynkoop, leads the investigation and also wrote the report that went back to Washington. Colonel Chivington was censured in the finding of 3 inquiries: those of a joint congressional committee on the conduct of the war, a joint special committee to inquire into the condition of the Indian tribes, and a military commission. Witness testimony against Chivington came from his political rivals, Captain Silas Soule, the conscientious objector of the battle, Mr. John S. Smith, Lieutenant James D. Cannon, and Lieutenant Colonel Samuel F. Tappan. The exception to this was Major Scott Anthony, who resigned his commission and minimized his own participation in the massacre after opinion in the War Department sided with Wynkoop's report. Testimony was highly sensational in its gory details on the mutilation of Indian bodies, but a surprising amount of it was prefaced by, "They told me," he said, "I heard," and even, "according to representations made in our presence," and not nearly enough of it by, "I saw." These testimonies characterized the Sand Creek Massacre for the next 150 years, along with first-hand accounts such as J.P. Dunn's account of the incident, published in 1886, 23 years after the fact, complete with quotations, is taken as the gospel truth, without a mention of the previous 2 years of Indian massacres of white settlements and the political aspirations and convictions of the individuals involved. Whichever side of the retelling you choose to believe, it is doubtless that the event had severe repercussions for the Cheyenne. Upwards of 150 Cheyenne were killed, 74 of those being women and children. Black Kettle would escape the fight and link up with the Dog Soldiers further north to continue the Cheyenne War against the settlers.